60s wrestling, 70s wrestling, 80s wrestling, or, as I was told, UFC. You can call up for Bill Watson about 25 minutes, and we'll go through a lot of that period and a lot of the big angles. And so anyway, I'm like very much looking forward to the show. And believe me, who knows what's going to happen on this show?
Who knows, indeed.
Who knows? This one. Who knows what's going to happen? That's all I could say. But I'm sure, I'm sure it will be entertaining. If you ever heard Bill Watts's interviews on DVDs and things like that, very outspoken, a lot to say, and we're going to hear it. And, of course, talk about the book. And the book, I have read the book. It is not out yet, but interesting book, good book. So, anyway, that's that. Brian, is any notes as far as the TNA pay-per-view right now?
Well, it looks like there's the Austin Aries Roderick Strong versus the Naturals match to open up, and so far nothing has happened except Christian has arrived, and as I noted before we went on the air, they need a TV dress code, at least for champions and challengers. Okay, well, that tells you something right there. This week, I guess the biggest news story of the week is very sad story, Matt Cappotelli. Most of you will probably remember him as one of the co-winners with Johnny Nitro of Tough Enough 3, was diagnosed with brain cancer. He made the announcement at the OVW show on Wednesday night. It was actually put up on the WWE website the next morning, so a lot of people have seen it. And if you haven't, you can go up there and actually watch it. It was a tremendous interview, and a lot has been said and about that. But we really wish him the best. It's cancer. It's tough battle. It could be worse. It hasn't spreading slowly actually. And probably going to need surgery, perhaps chemotherapy, radiation. He's in for a tough fight, obviously the toughest fight of his life. Okay, I want to mention also that tomorrow night there is no Raw because of the Westminster Dog Show. The Raw will air on Thursday night. It's actually going to be taped tomorrow night in Greensboro, and on the website, we will tomorrow night, after the show, we will have the results up, so you don't want to wait. They'll be there. But anyway, it's the Triple H tournament with Triple H against Big Show and Chris Masters against Rob Van Dam, plus the Shawn Michaels retirement, and don't worry, he's not retiring. Nobody does. And main event, Edge against John Cena with Mick Foley as referee, and obviously, I think it's no secret that this leads to Edge against Mick Foley at WrestleMania. And very interesting thing when we speak of Mick Foley. What was your take on what Mick Foley, or have you even read what Mick Foley wrote on the WWE website? Basically, he was critical of the company for the exploitation of the death of Eddie Guerrero. I read it, and I really don't know what to make of it. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. If it would have appeared at any other time, then right before he was coming back to set up a feud with Edge and go to WrestleMania, I may have seen it differently, but I don't know, the timing was just odd. Well, it was odd because that's when he wrote it. I mean, it was just, I don't know, it was interesting. I mean, everything he wrote, wasn't anything. No, the fact that he did it, though, on their site. Yeah. And by the way, you will not be seeing stuff like that. I don't want to say ever again, but probably never again on that site, similar to that, by the way. So, but it got up there. It got up there, and they didn't take it down, which, and I think there was a reason they didn't take it down, because I think that the outcry, if they had taken it down, would have been worse than keeping it up. Yeah. So, but I mean, the interesting part of that was that he wrote that because there were several guys who, wrestlers in the company who asked him to. I mean, this wasn't just one guy's opinion. I mean, and it's just, there's a lot to that story. It's quite the story. A lot of, Brian, you and I have been talking about it for, since they did that angle at the end of November. A lot of people unhappy, but nothing's going to, it's going to keep going. And they've got a job. They've got a job. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse, and Vicky Guerrero will be at ringside at No Way Out this coming Sunday. So it will get much worse. In the Rey Mysterio-Randy Orton match. I believe the daughters will be at ringside as well. In fact, I'm almost positive of that, actually. So, it's going to be what it is. Very interesting angle, very controversial angle, to say the least. Part of it is almost like, I saw it up there and I thought,
Vince can't be happy that there's, this sort of column up on his site, but at the same time, there's got to be part of him that is just reveling in the controversy.
Yeah, I think that there
are certain things that can be written negative about the company that I don't think he would be happy about being up there, really unhappy, such as stuff about writing being bad or whatever, because that's something that's not controversy that he can really try and make money off of. But something like this is a sort of thing where, yeah, this is controversy and people are very, very upset about it, but he's trying to make money off people's emotions and being upset about it. So I can see how this would be something that perhaps he would leave up there.
At the same time, it's because of the nature of what it is, it's questioning his judgment, and he doesn't like that.
That's true.
I think that if it was in another, if it was controversy over something that he can lay off on someone else, but it's not like this is the writing team. You know what I'm saying? Oh, I'll give you an example. And granted, it's not exactly making money, but it sort of was when Austin, complained, years ago about the writing team. He did it on their Bite This show, and I remember thinking, like, there's no way that Steve Austin did this on Bite This and it's not a work, right? And the next thing you know, a week later, he's out of the company.
He was in big trouble.
Yeah, and they wanted to humiliate him. And
that was a writing deal thing. It wasn't like he was this is a totally different sort of situation.
No. This is an angle that he's talking about an ongoing angle, not about the writing
really he's
itself.
Playing into it.
Yeah. Playing into the controversy, but pretty much also not in the sense of saying that, it was, he's blaming it on the writing team. He's not blaming, or not the writing team, but he's blaming it on the company, not blaming it on Randy Orton. So in that sense, he's getting away from the story. Like if he had written it saying, Randy Orton shouldn't have done it, which he could have done, that would have more played into the controversy. I think he was pretty careful not to do that, actually.
Yeah.
But that's quite a little tricky
the
thing.
Naturals, of all people, just won the opener, by the way.
Well, yeah, I guess it's getting back because they lost on the TV show a couple weeks ago, or actually 8 days ago. So, well, that's interesting. We'll probably have what would be the second match on the show? Who's second? I don't even remember off the top of my head. It's a four-way with Jay Lethal, Matt Bentley, and Alex Shelley, and somebody else.
I see.
I don't have the card in front of me. So anyway, that should be up next. We're going to try to take as many calls as we can before Bill Watts comes on. And then from that point on, we'll be taking calls for Bill Watts and Scott Williams. So we are going to start with Chris in Chicago. Chris, what's going on?
Hey, man, how's it going?
It's going pretty good.
Yeah, I'm just calling about, I'm the one that pointed out to Hulk about the buy rate for SummerSlam.
Uh-huh.
And I know that, he didn't get the payoff that he was supposed to.
Are you Crusader?
Yes, I am.
Well, gosh, but, it's nice to talk to you.
Hello.
I know who you are, and I know that, you're one of Hulk's best friends.
Yes.
Okay. But anyway, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to call and see, what is your take on the low payoffs, for such a large buy rate for the main event guys?
See, I don't know. I don't know exactly what he got. So if I don't know what he got, I've heard what he said. Kind of, the line about it was a great payoff for his limo driver type of a thing. That was a phenomenal buy rate, and there's no question that he and Shawn Michaels and actually maybe to a small extent Bret Hart drew a much bigger buy rate than they would have done without it. So he, again, not knowing what the number is, I would think that the fair number for him would be pretty darn high. But what that is, I don't know. 640,000 buys is a lot of buys at $35 a head, and a lot more buys than the show did the year before, and probably more than it's going to do this year.
I just wonder why Vince, he always seems to toy with Hulk in the sense that he rips him off on merchandise money, and like he always tries to derail Hulk, but he always asks him to come back to do another show. So I just what do you think about that? And, what do you think is Vince's reasoning? For
that's a tough one. It's a weird dynamic there because I think I don't really have an answer. I think Vince likes to prove that he's the one in charge because there's always going to be this thing of in the 80s when wrestling went to that next level. It was Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon, and it was a joint effort between the two of them. And I think that in Vince's mind, I think he really wants more credit than Hulk because to the general public, they see it as the star that did it, and they both did it. Hope, if it was Jimmy Snuka or Kerry Von Erich in that position, the odds are wrestling wouldn't have been anywhere close to as big. And but if there was another promoter who wasn't as good as Vince, even with Hogan, it probably wouldn't have been as big. Even though Hulk did real well with Vern, and if Vern went national with Hulk, I mean, he'd have still been the biggest star of the '80s. But would he have been as big? Probably not.
Right,
so,
yeah.
But it's hard for me to say. Everyone's going to have that issue with Vince. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
Everyone on top. I'm sure. It's a weird thing. I mean, because if you look back at all of the guys who were superstars under Vince, with very few exceptions. You talk about the top guys like Hogan and Piper and Savage and Steve Austin and Rock and Bret Hart. I mean, like every one of them, in the end, there was always that, there's always the problem, I guess is the way to put it.
Right.
Over whether it's finishes or whatever, like when Hogan came back in, was it 2002?
Yeah.
I mean, they didn't use him correctly. I mean, I think the whole idea was, and I think that when he came back after that, I think that, they kind of understood that, Hogan's role shouldn't be to put everyone over. He could put one guy over and make it mean something, but if he's putting everyone over, it doesn't even mean anything. And then the people, that's not what they want from Hulk Hogan. They want Hulk Hogan to be the fantasy.
It's a shame because, they're going to miss the ball on Hogan versus Austin for WrestleMania, which would have been huge.
Yeah, it would have been huge, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. It doesn't look like Austin's going to do it or Hogan. So,
no. That I know for a fact. And that's,
well, and you know more than me. I'm of the impression at the same time, that he's got his TV show and Vince has WrestleMania, and they both could use each other come March. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Brian, there has been a lot of talk, WWE and UFC on what is fair. What's fair payoff? We just talked with Chris Sater about that. To me, I always think that a fair payoff is, a certain percentage. I don't know what the percentage is, but the percentage going in, and then you break it off. And there's always going to be, everyone's going to be unhappy with their money to an extent. But, if you're paying like 8% of total revenue to talent, there's something wrong. I don't know why. It's a funny thing. And I don't know what it is when it comes to, and I've seen it with the fight fans a lot in the last, always actually, and not boxing fans, but UFC fans. I see it with pro wrestling fans. For some reason, I don't know what it is. If they believe that guys should be performing what they do for our entertainment, but as long as they get a livable wage, it's fine, even if they draw tons of money, because people would love to have it, but. And if you compare it to, say, what a baseball player makes that draws the same amount of money, or a football player or a boxer, it's like, oh, you can't compare them. And actually, if they draw the same amount of money, I don't know why you can't compare them.
Well, the first thing is, if it's David Aldane, I believe his name is, $2,000, that's not a fair payoff.
Gilbert Aldana in that...
Gilbert
Aldana in that fight got $2,000 against Paul Buntello for that great fight.
$2,000.
That's right. And I mean, and that fight was a war. He got knocked out. He gave you an entertaining fight. Do you realize, $2,000, do you know that the ringside seats for that show were $700? That means that if me and my wife and my son bought 3 tickets, we spent more money than that man got paid.
Yeah.
And that's not to mention the hundreds of thousands of people on pay-per-view. And, with pro wrestling, I see pro wrestling in the sense of fair payoffs as similar in the sense of when a couple of years ago, when UFC was not generating money and people were complaining about the low payoffs, it was like, they're losing money. It's like they're actually overpaid, even though it looks like they're not, because they're not drawing the money. You can't compare them. And people go, oh, well, the wrestlers or the boxers get so much money, but they were drawing that much money. Well, now, when they're drawing the same amount of money as a huge boxing show, they're still not getting the money. So there's something wrong there. And with the wrestlers, if they're entertainers and they're drawing the money, they, again, I don't know what a fair percentage is. Like in the old territorial days, there were companies that paid wrestlers 15% of the gross, and there were companies that paid 45% of the gross. And, most were probably closer to 25. And I don't know what the fair number is, but,
Well, I will say also, when you guys were talking about Hogan, whatever Hogan made at SummerSlam and whatever he thought he was going to make, he's in a position where he can sort of complain about it. But I'm sure there are a lot of guys, mid-card and undercard guys, who probably get checks and go, I was just raped here with this pay-per-view payoff, and they're in no position to say anything. So,
Well, I mean, I remember when the I think it was the Hardy Boys, Dudleys, and Edge and Christian years ago did one of the TLC's matches, and I don't know if it was the WrestleMania one or I don't remember which one it was, but they got a really nothing payoff, and they were really upset. Yet, because they had that spectacular match, and yet at the same time, I can tell you from from a WWE standpoint, I'm sure that they're going. Well, you had a great match and you risked life and limb, but you also were not the guys on top who drew the house.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting thing. Are Bill Watts and Scott Williams up right now? Because actually, Bill Watts would probably be a better person to talk about this than me, being that he ran a company for years and years. Are they up? Is Bill and Scott up? Momentarily? Okay. Bill Watts, are you there?
Yes.
This is Bill Watts, of course, one of the great wrestlers of the 60s and 70s, and ran Mid-South Wrestling. And Bill, you're going to be on the other side of this one. What is a main event wrestler worth? I mean, that's kind of an interesting, or fighter for that matter, because I know you're a big fight fan. We lost him? Oh God, well, we'll get Bill Watts back momentarily. So Bill Watts, before he is back on, I want to mention that Bill Watts and Scott Williams wrote the book Cowboy and the Cross, which is an autobiography of Bill Watts dating back to football player at University of Oklahoma. The old territorial days, he wrestled all the big stars of the 60s and 70s, was the legend, in the Oklahoma area for a long, long time, and ended up owning the promotion, Mid-South Wrestling, through the 80s, sold it to Jim Crockett in 1987. During the 80s, Mid-South Wrestling generally considered the best wrestling television show of its time, and if you watch the tapes now, it really holds up. I mean, because it was storytelling. It was good, solid wrestling, but tremendous storytelling was the hallmark of Mid-South Wrestling. Scott, are you there?
I am here.
Scott. Okay.
How are y'all doing?
We're doing good. Is Bill back?
Yes.
Bill, we were talking before you were on the air about, and you are someone who, ran a company for years and years and helped run other companies and booked and everything on that. So you've been on both sides and been a main event wrestler. You've been on both sides of the fence. When it comes to, payoffs, it's an abstract term, but what's a fair payoff for a main event guy who's a money draw, who's not a money draw? Do you have any kind of thoughts on that subject?
Well, again, you generally paid a percent of the net gate after taxes to the talent, and certainly the only place people are created equal is in the Constitution of the United States, but in reality they're not, so you certainly took care of people. You generally paid what you thought drew the money. Once we got to the place where we had super cards, which we kind of pioneered, and I learned a lot of that from Eddie Graham, you could have a key guy that really contributed a lot, and he may not be in the main event, or you might have a guy. So you paid a lot different. You paid what you thought was going to the people that you thought drew the gate. And, unfortunately, if you owned the business and were doing the booking and the televisions and everything else, that was a judgment call. So I'm sure at times the guy didn't feel like he got it completely fair, or vice versa, but you did the best you could. The big difference was back then, if they weren't happy, they had a lot of places to go.
Yeah. Well, and also in that era, one of the big differences of that era is today is, I think that generally speaking, there's a shelf life of talent that can be on fire. I mean, you can be strong and draw for a while, but on fire, you're going to have a limited shelf life, just like a band or something. And in the old system, after a year or whatever it was, 2 years, 6 months, if it started to cool off, you could go somewhere else, do the same act, and you're fresh, and then you could bring in someone from another territory. And, it was a constant revolving door of talent, and I think that it kept things a lot fresher. I mean, with you, you could do lose or leave towns, and the guys actually would leave because they were actually going somewhere else.
Well, if you recall, Dave, when I went and tried to straighten out the stuff at Turner Broadcasting, that was the big thing I saw, is that I don't care if you had chocolate cake, you're going to get tired of it if you have it every week. And already by then there was a stagnation of talent. So you remember we started setting up the small towns, first of all, to get the young kids out to where they could work in front of a crowd within a drivable distance to get the experience, because you're not going to get the experience to really be a quality talent doing the short television matches. And, yeah, there's a huge stagnation. How do you think guys that are at the age they are from the old school are still holding on? The fact is they know their craft very, very well. that's really an indictment about how bad the business has gotten, because there is a talent stagnation and there's nowhere for the new talent really to learn. I mean, you can learn just so much in a gym, but in reality, it's just like anything else. You've got to learn it in the real action, and that's very hard for people to do today.
What do you think of the idea of somebody fighting for UFC and going home with a $2,000 payoff?
Is that what they get at UFC? I was curious.
An undercard guy.
One guy on the last undercard, and this was their most successful show, actually got a $2,000 payoff, who actually was in one of the best matches on the show.
Which one was that?
If you watch, it was Gilbert Aldana, who got knocked out by Paul Buentello.
Well, first of all, I enjoy watching UFC. I was very curious because it's really seemed like it's had tremendous growth. Their live gate sells out, and I guess they must be doing very, very well on pay-per-view because they've increased their price per buy.
Yeah.
But let's face it, again, if it's the only show in town that you can do that, and you're hungry, you're going to go there and try to improve your position. I don't know what the guys on top make, but you got to go to try to improve. That's what an athlete does. That's what it was. You got to realize back when I played pro football, my contract with the Houston Oilers was for $8,000, as a lineman, and my contract with the Minnesota Vikings was $7,000. So you're talking about, again, that if that was the only show in town, and that's what you wanted to do, then you had to go play. But what you did is you hoped that you could improve your value. And that was the concept of any guy with a competitor's heart, is that just give me a shot. Let me in the door, and I believe in myself, and I believe I have a value where I can move up the ladder. So, again, I have no idea what their costs are and all those things. So it would be unfair for me to critique it one way or another. But if they didn't want to fight for $2,000, they didn't have to be there. Nobody twisted their arm and made them be there.
Now, when you were going through your career in the different territories, what territories would you say that you learned the most, and what and what people did you learn the most from to create the different ideas that led you to the concept of television? Because a lot of people don't know this, but when you were when you started doing the television, I guess late 70s with Mid-South Wrestling, or maybe 1980 or so, most wrestling shows, that studio shows, were kind of the same, which would be squash matches, or a star would beat a job guy in a couple of minutes and then do an interview, and then do an interview and build up the match at the house show against another guy. And you changed that format. It's kind of a format that now Raw and SmackDown are like, where you would have a lot more matches, let's face it, where you didn't know who was going to win or lose, which was very different from the other wrestling shows of the time.
Well, again, you really coined it. I called them formula matches. And as you worked different territories, which I did, you learned from the people there and the promoter. You learned the things you like, and you learned the things you didn't like. And one of the things I didn't like was the boring squash matches. And when you'd go to the arena in the East for Vince's dad, which was a very successful place business-wise, and the television people, they'd sit there on their hands because they were bored to tears. The dark match was always the same ending. It'd go 5 minutes before live TV and have what they call a schmoz, where they'd both get counted out or both doubled. And I thought, my golly, this is horrible. And why not, if you're going to be there, have a crowd? Well, then when I got into the promotion, which was in 1970, I'm in an area that doesn't have that population. I'm in an area where there's a very limited population. I mean, you're talking in Oklahoma, the biggest city is Oklahoma City, which is about 600,000, and Tulsa's 400,000. And so then we had the Louisiana market, and there weren't that many big cities there, and Mississippi. So what I understood was we needed to make our television so exciting that we had huge ratings. And back then, when I bought in, they were running weekly shows. So I wanted it to be so exciting that on TV that they would come to see the events and keep that excitement and that momentum going. And so that was our concept, that we were going to try to cram every hour with as much as we could. Well, you can't do that and keep it exciting with squash matches. And then, too, I did some commentary, not because I wanted to commentate, but because I understood what I wanted the people at home to feel and to think about the holes and the wrestling and where it's going. And the most boring thing in the world was for me to have to sit there and commentate a squash match. And then if I was a promoter, and I'm sitting there commentating a squash match, I think, boy, the people must think, how could you put such a lousy match on television? Where's your responsibility? So it was an evolution of that, and I learned a lot of that from Eddie Graham. He was, I think, Eddie Graham. If I was going to, I used to tease Eddie because Eddie had never finished school, and he used to say to me, "You're a college guy. What'd you come down here and work for me for?" And I said, "I came to get my PhD in wrestling." But I learned something from Gagne. I learned Gagne had great vision for the big picture. He just didn't like to do the details, and Wally Carbo then handled the details. I learned from Vince's dad because he certainly knew how to do certain things. I learned a tremendous amount from Roy Shires. Roy Shires was a genius. He just didn't know how to delegate anything, so everything sounded like Roy Shires. He told you everything about the interview and everything else, and but he was a genius as far as the wrestling business. So I think you learn something from. I learned a lot from Leroy McGurk. You learn from everybody. You learned what you liked and what you didn't like. I didn't ever realize I was going to be a promoter. People looked back later and said, "Oh, we always knew you were going to be." But I think Larry Hennig said at one time, the best I ever heard. He said, "We're instruments in the hands of fools." Well, then there's only one way. If you want to have a say in your destiny, was to get somewhere where you could have some actual say in it. And then I was very successful at that.
How much? No, where do you, as far as like a lot of in that era, you know, and with you and with you know, the other people that you worked with on top, I think the key in that period, and to an extent, and actually to a great extent now, was the ability to do a promo. And does that, in your experience dealing with a lot of talent, where perhaps there were guys who were great workers who maybe couldn't do a promo, or maybe guys that you were able to teach to promos?
Certainly.
I mean, what is it? What do you think the key is?
Yeah. You know what I really realized that day was Ed Francis had a promotion in Honolulu. And we used to work at going through to Japan or something like that. But then when I was working for Shires and I was his champion, Shires and Francis made a deal where they'd promote the HIC, which was the big building then in Honolulu, together. Because, I mean, Ed Francis had the same problem. He had the guys that loved to stay in Hawaii, you know, but it was the same guys every week, so he needed to have that something to bring to the big show. And I'll never forget staying over there one time and watched him do a TV, and if I'm not wrong, I think he had 90 minutes of television. And in that 90 minutes, he had 2 matches. And the rest of it was interviews. I mean, he had some of the greatest guys on the stick I ever saw. Lord Blears was great, but Ed Francis was the greatest stick man of all. Curtis Iakia would sit with his back to the camera talking into a mirror. And it was just awesome, the interviews. But then the greatest one was Johnny Barron, handsome Johnny Barron. And, I mean, he had that place on fire. He had psychologists writing in trying to figure it out. I read some of their mail. But Ed would go up and knock, and they'd have a coffin standing up. And then all of a sudden the door would creak open, and Johnny Barron would be inside the coffin standing on his head smoking a cigar. And then he'd get up and he'd start talking to Francis. And then he did this Johnny Barron nursery rhyme for kids that was almost like a who's the great terror movie guy, Steven, whatever. And I mean, it was mind-boggling. And then I realized when you're out there wrestling, there's just so much you can do. The people really want to know your personality because the people have to relate to the person that's their hero or the person they dislike. So actually what a guy said was more important than what he did in the ring to a certain extent. But I wanted to have a combination of it, and you hit the nail on the head. Some guys could not interview but were great talent, like the Spoiler. The Spoiler never drew any money without the mask. Neither did Dick Beyer. Dick Beyer never drew any money without the mask. So it seemed like getting under that mask, it was almost like he released a certain something in him. But then with the Spoiler, then Dick Beyer was a very good interview guy, by the way. But then the Spoiler had to have somebody like Gary Hart or somebody like that and would draw tons of money. Or you could take a guy like Waldo Von Erich, who was limited maybe in the ring, but was one of the greatest interviewers. I'll tell you, Mad Dog Vachon.
Oh, what an interview.
Oh, I mean, Mad Dog was not a great worker, not very big, but he was so damn ferocious, and he believed in himself, and he was truly a tough guy, so his interviews would like he was going to tear your heart out. And, I mean, Mad Dog Vachon was just powerful with these interviews. The Crusher, Lazowski. Here's a guy that I learned so much from him because he could get a match out of anybody. He knew his gimmick, and he knew how to present it, and he knew how to present anybody in it. The first time when I saw him and Mad Dog Vachon in St. Paul, Minnesota, do the death match where neither one of them could see, the Algerian death match. He wanted me to second him. I said, I'm not going to second you. That's going to kill the business. That's so bad. He said, Cowboy, you're my partner, but I can get anybody. And I realized he could get anybody. He was that good. And I said, well, wait a minute. You're right. I'll back you. And I went out there and thought it was going to stink the place out. They had a match that was unbelievable, and later I took it to the Superdome and called it a Jim Bowie death match and booked Dick Murdoch and Killer Carl Cox in it and drew a giant house. So, I mean, you learn from everybody, and you're right. The guys that could talk, Pampiro Firpo, he wasn't a great worker, but he had a great interview. So the interview, Fritz von Erich, it was something about that interview.
Looking back on the WCW stint, would you there were probably so many problems just inherent in that thing. On paper from the outside, this looked like the greatest thing because you had a television company owning the wrestling company, and you would think that there were certain pressures that you had when you ran your own company of having to make payroll every week and things like that weren't as big with a big TV company, plus you were providing content for them that could draw ratings, which wrestling in that era and still today still can do. Yet it was an absolute mess. And, explain kind of like your thoughts in hindsight on all that.
Well, I tell you, you sure hit the nail on the head. You'd think going in there that with Turner Broadcasting behind you, that it would be a given. I mean, for the fact that Turner Broadcasting couldn't beat Vince McMahon is just mind-boggling because you had everything. You had the control of the cable market. You had the powerhouse. You had a guy with 30 companies. You would just think. So, when I went in there, I was supposed to have autonomy, and that just didn't work out. They just everybody that you wanted to get rid of that wasn't doing a good job had a daddy somewhere in that company. It's so funny that when I got there, they showed me a survey. They'd spent $30,000 accumulating, where they'd asked the people. They'd actually gone into the field with a survey group to ask the people what they wanted for their wrestling. And it was completely opposite of what Vince was presenting. Now, you got to realize, I believe Vince McMahon's a genius. But he was the originator of bringing the cartoon characters to life. I mean, that's what I thought his wrestling was cartoon characters brought to life. And they spent $30,000, which back in that era was a lot of money to spend on a survey as to what the people wanted. And they went, instead of giving them that, they had tried to copy Vince. Well, you can't out-innovate the innovator. So to copy Vince was a lost cause. So we changed it and went the other direction. Now, also the first thing they said is, we're losing $8 million a year. Can you bring it in without losing $8 million a year? And I've always believed, because I owned the companies I was in, that you had to have a bottom line, that you had to net, because you were out of business if you didn't. So certainly that was my goal, and I think we brought it in at a $400,000 loss in the 11 months I was there. That's from an $8 million loss down to a $400,000 loss, and I couldn't even get the guy I reported to give us a letter of commendation, because all the internal politics, and matter of fact, as I was leaving, they had a company come in to do an internal politic thing, and the guy talked to me. He said, I have never seen a company that is that's such turf building. And so we had no cooperation. We had the lousiest television equipment. I mean, Vince, when I worked with him, he had stuff that he could put a montage on the end of the show that he was doing right then. They couldn't do that at Turner Broadcasting. We had the leftovers. You had and just like you said, here's a show that they had unbelievable television content that always produced higher than station average ratings. And yet the guys at the TV stations wanted to replace it all the time with a movie package. And you'd have the same problem. Movie packages are great, but eventually people get tired of seeing the same movies. So Ted understood what wrestling did for his station. So he stood there, but by then Ted had gotten so far out of the link that you couldn't go meet with Ted personally about the problems ongoing, and there was a real can of worms. It was just an unbelievable can of worms there. The next thing is all the talent had contracts.
If I can break in, I think is important for people to understand.
Go ahead,
when looking, as Brian has certainly done, writing the Death of WCW book, when looking at the history of that company, Eric Bischoff gets a lot of credit for being able to do things that made that company more competitive than it had ever been. And, well, I don't know Eric Bischoff personally. I don't have anything against him one way or the other, but I think a lot of that credit is misplaced, because the fact is Eric Bischoff was able to get a different mandate from Turner than anybody running that company previously had. He got them in a position where they were opening up the purse strings, and the mandate for Eric Bischoff was a lot different than the one that Mr. Watts had. When he went up there, Bischoff's mandate was not to cut the losses. Bischoff's mandate became put up a fully competitive company to what Vince McMahon was doing.
Well, when I went
he certainly had advantages in being able to do things like establish the Nitro and go head-to-head against McMahon, which is nothing.
Bischoff didn't originate that idea. When I went there, it was real simple. We had the first thing I wanted to do was go head up to Vince, because anything we could take off of Vince, that was his sole deal with Turner Broadcasting, was just another show. So if anything we could bleed off of Vince, that's what I wanted to do, and they wouldn't let me. The claim was, well, we can't do it. Our cable partners won't like it. Wasn't it funny then? They could sure do it when they wanted to, when they went head to head with Vince. And I'll tell you, it drove Vince nuts for a while. And finally, that's one of the things I sat down and discussed with him before I left there. I said, you got to go back to being the innovator. You're letting these guys drive you crazy. They can't out-innovate you. They can't make the changes you can make. And you just got to go back. And by that time, Vince had a group in New York that watched his show, and if they thought they were too violent, they would have him censor his own shows. And I said, you've got to be crazy having people watch your show that have censor value and are telling you it's too violent. You need to get back to the mud, the blood, and the beer. That's what made wrestling. And you're in a war, and you might as well treat it like that. Well, and I can't take credit for what he did, because the things he did. But that's what he did. He quit letting people hold the skids on it, and he went back to the old-fashioned type of thing.
There's so much to talk about with Bill Watts, and we'll be jumping around because I've got so many things written down here. But anyway, one of the things I want to talk to you about, we're going to go back to 1985-ish. Mid-South Wrestling was doing very strong business. Wrestling business was starting to constrict. The territories were going to go down, there's no question. Of course, WWE had just started going national. Jim Crockett was starting to go national with the Road Warriors and Ric Flair. Vern Gagne was trying to survive, and he still had a fairly strong talent pool, although his company was dwindling. And you had made a deal to get on TBS, which was a pretty darn big deal at the time. Vince was on TBS at the same time. He had a better time slot than you. You were drawing better ratings than him. In fact, for a while there, your show was the #1 rated show on cable I think it was on for about 13 weeks. And a lot of people don't know this, but you and Ted Turner actually had, I don't know if it was a verbal deal, but what was the story behind you and Ted Turner in 1985?
We had a deal where we shook hands and had a deal. And, and I believed him. And I reacted like that, and we got our show on. And matter of fact, the thing that you just said about our ratings were just amazing, because, basically speaking, we weren't even locked in. We jumped around some and still outrated everything. And Vince was on, and Ted said, well, I'll get Vince off, and we got a deal. And we reacted to that. We went to work getting ready to be able to do what we were going to do, is just come over and produce the television and take over the television. And all of a sudden, Vince and he got into it, and one thing led to another, and the next thing I knew, Crockett had it. So, there's rumors that he and Crockett met somewhere, and Crockett offered him $1 million. I don't know all the ins and outs. The key thing is this. The wrestling business, we were doing very well. And anytime Vince or Crockett came in, Crockett didn't come in our area, but when Vince came to our area, we killed him. He told me when I went back and worked for him for 3 months just to kind of get to know him a little bit and see if I wanted to stay in the business or not. He told me, he said, you just beat us to death every time we came. I mean, we just shellacked them. That wasn't what hurt us. What hurt us was the oil crunch. When you're in the oil states, and I remember years ago when the Sheik, who ran Detroit, when the car industry went down, and he was moaning about the wrestling business. And I thought, what does that have to do with the wrestling business? Well, when the oil went from, when you got states that are set up for their government to operate on $20 a barrel oil to break even, and the oil goes to $8 a barrel, the bottom fell out. So you not only had all entertainment canceled in the oil states. They canceled in Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma. Your rock and roll bands, your country western, because they came in, they couldn't draw anything. You had Braniff Airlines go broke. You had banks going broke left and right, because all banking was set up on equity and property. And with everybody being foreclosed on, there was no equity in property. It changed the banking laws, if you remember. It went upside down here. And so our base, that was our base. My new syndicator, He was a guy that had a lot of money and was doing a good job, and all. The next thing I know, he can't pay his bills. And the guy that was backing him, he lost a major hope. So that was what happened. It just was the timing of a mega trend that we got caught into, and we go into that. Scott and I go into that pretty good in the book about the mega trend, because the bad thing about a mega trend like that is your normal indicators that you read are no good. And so what you think, you're looking at yourself and blaming it on yourself, and you have nothing, absolutely nothing. There's just nothing that you can even do to change it. So it's a horrible, horrible situation, because everything that you used to be able to read to tell where your business was had no effect. And that's what really happened with the oil crunch, and that's what also made such a dramatic difference in our business long term. And at the same time, I was wanting to get out of the business. And so when I wanted to get out of the business, then and when the deal with Turner didn't go, that didn't get lived up to, then there was another way to go, and that's what we decided to do, and we did that.
Now, as far as when you were out, I mean, were you thinking about coming back? Did you miss it? Because you did come. You came back twice. You came back once for WCW, and then you came back once for a very brief period of time with Vince McMahon. And what didn't work with Vince McMahon?
Everything worked out good with Vince. Vince and I just did a 3-month contract. And Vince is a tremendously intense guy. We got along just great booking. I mean, you could book with him because he had a long-range vision, and that's kind of the way I like to be. I like to know where I was going with stuff. And with Vince, he was very, very good about that. He booked just like I like to book, where you get out there and then you get out to where you want to be, and then you book backwards. How do I get there? So he and I were great at that. But Vince was under a lot of pressure. His company, as a matter of fact, when I went there, he says, "What would you think of a guy that grossed $85 million and lost $5 million?" And I said, "Well, he'd have to have a special case of the dumbass." I just don't know how you do that in wrestling. And Vince said, "I just did that." I said, "Well, that's what I heard." But the difference in Vince and Turner Broadcasting is Vince went to work, and he cut everything out of his company that was fat. Anything that wasn't pulling his weight, he cut it. So he was right in the middle of going through that and a lot of other things. So in his creative team, we had a lot of things going, but Vince is a hands-on guy. He's like I was. He's a hands-on guy, but he was so occupied that you just sit around and wait for him, and then we go to his house and do booking. And there were so many interruptions, and we made a lot of headway because I'm so outspoken, which anybody that's been around me know. And we'd sit there when he'd take a phone call, and finally I'd say, "Look, Vince, you're the boss. You sign the checks, but I'm not sitting here while you take phone calls twiddling my hands. When we come out here to do booking, let's do booking." And the same thing at the television productions. He'd get to TV production, and he'd have to hold everybody's hand. Everybody that had a bitch or a gripe, he had to deal with them. And I said, "Vince, when you're here at TV, we got to get you to a place where you understand your talent tonight. All you are tonight is talent, and you have to do your job." So anyway, he basically turned over the television to me. And we were on the way home after about the second one we did like that, where he became talent while he was there. And he pulled the car over. I'll never forget this. He said, "Get out of the car and come around here and give me a hug." He said, "I have never seen television handled like that." That was awesome. So he and I we really hit it off on a lot of areas. But again, he was a hands-on kind of guy, and he just couldn't stand not doing every single thing. And the problem with me was, at that point in my life, I knew I didn't want to live back there and stay back there full time. And I knew that it was real simple. There was only room for one Titan at Titan. And so he one day called me in and he said, "Bill," he said, I just can't do it this way. I gotta have my hand in everything, and I gotta have everything revolve around me." And I said, "Well, Vince, I'm not willing to become a zombie like these other guys, because I think there's more to life than wrestling, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life just waiting on you to breathe so I can breathe." He said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Vince, it's easy. This is your company. Dude, I just had a 3-month contract. That's up." I said, "I'm going home." He said, "No hard feelings?" I said, "No hard feelings." And he gave me a nice severance package. I mean, he treated me like $1 million. I don't have a single negative. There was no negative about my experience there.
Actually, Bill, I don't think we got an answer to the question about when you first got out of wrestling, were you thinking about coming back at some point, or did you just figure you were just finished?
No, I was perfectly happy being out of it. I think what happens, you get out of something like that you've been in all your life, you feel kind of like a dinosaur, and it takes you time to adjust, and so I think we're made to be productive, and trying to figure out what I was going to do the rest of my life and different things happening. That when the first thing with Turner Broadcasting came up, I thought, well, that would really be exciting to get over there and to do something like that and to see if I can contribute again. And the great thing was, as far as my understanding and my skill level with the television and talent, and as Dave calls it, episodic TV, we did great. If you recall, when we made Ron Simmons the first black world's champion from a major promotion ever in Baltimore, which is a tough market, people in the crowd were crying. I mean, they were literally so emotionally caught up in everything we did that it proved once again that if you did things and did them in a right way, that the people would just love it, that the people would just go crazy and have all that old time emotion right there. So when I got out, I was fine, but you got to realize back then my marriage there were so many things hit me, so many different ways that when an opportunity came, I came back to what I thought I knew. That all the things that I was trying to get out of my life at that time, they came back too with it. So I knew that wrestling wasn't going to be something I was going to stay in.
When you watch UFC right now, I mean, do you ever get the urge to go, hey, this is, I promoted something. I mean, it's not exactly this, but the emotion is very similar. Two tough guys battling it out. I mean, or I don't know, even boxing or something like that. Do you ever get any kind of an urge to promote in that field?
Yeah, at one time I had designed a thing that I realized would take a great educational factor that was close to UFC, where the wrestling was going to be 100% shoot. And so we were going to have teams and franchises and stuff like that and catch weights and then I just thought, it takes so much money and you'd have to have an educational factor with it, and it just never worked out. Again, I was going through a lot in my own life. There was a lot that I was dealing with. As a lot of you know, I had an experience that was a spiritual experience, and I had to really figure my walk out on that, and that wasn't easy for me because it was such a tremendously different thing. I think so many people when they become Christians, they try to put a little bow and a tie on it, and it's very hard to do that because it's life, and you're in a situation where you have a lot to learn about that walk. And so there was a lot of things going on in my life at that time that I really didn't have all the answers to.
Now, when I want to bring up a couple of names because in a lot of ways, the first big time, I guess, push for a lot of guys came under you, and Jim Cornette was really just, a lot of people don't know this, he was just basically a B manager in Nashville, Memphis, in that circuit behind Jimmy Hart, and you brought him in and went all the way with him, and within 3 months he was the top manager in the business. And Michael Hayes is another one I wanted to bring up, who had some success on a regional basis, but, he became, literally a superstar under you with the Freebirds, who, Terry Gordy and Buddy Roberts came together, and then you hooked Buddy Roberts, Terry Gordy and Michael Hayes came together, you hooked Buddy Roberts up with him. What did you see in those guys when they first came, and did they surprise you, or did you just see it right away?
Well, I'd like to sit here and tell you guys that in retrospect that, I was right every time, but that's just not how it happens. The one thing I always believed, if you saw somebody that hit a chord within me, was you had to put them in situations where they had to be stressed and really, they had to come to the table and they had to produce so you could watch them grow. The difference with me and that's one thing we knew we could always create talent, because that was the forte, was creating talent. Whereas with Vince, he'll come up with a name and a cartoon character, and he starts with that. Well, I never did that because I wanted the guy to be able to carry the load. Going back to Cornette, that was a situation where Jarrett and I had talked, and we decided that I'd go over and look at his talent, and he was stagnant, and he's wanting to do some changing. And then if I took some, then he'd take some of mine and trade. And I went over there and looked, and here's this Cornette underneath that, watching him, and he was just on a preliminary that night. I wanted to go slap him myself. And I thought, man, that's box office. And then Ricky and Robert, the Rock and Roll Express, they weren't doing anything. And then Cornette had Bobby Eaton. They weren't even teamed. He and Dennis Condrey. And so, basically speaking, Jarrett asked me to take them, and Jarrett should have gotten rid of Jimmy Hart then, and because Jimmy is a great talent, but he'd been there too long. But Jarrett wanted to keep Jimmy Hart and said, would you please take this Cornette kid? I like him, but I don't have any place for him. And I thought, oh my gosh, will I? And so that's how I got Jimmy Cornette. And then in the same deal, In the same deal, I got Bill Dundee. He wanted to get rid of Dundee because Dundee and Lawler had done everything they could do. There was nothing left for them to do, and so that was tired. And I got Bill Dundee, and one thing I realized with Dundee, what a mind he had. He had this mind that was awesome. He also had an ego that was awesome, and so I couldn't have him wrestle. I wouldn't let him wrestle, because if I'd have let him wrestle, he'd have been wanting to go over. If Andre the Giant would have come in, Dundee would try to figure a way that he should go over. So, I wouldn't let Dundee wrestle, but he was awesome in the book. And so that's how we do things with guys. We'd find out, do you have anything to bring to the table? You know, a lot of guys talk about Bill was a bully, this or that or the other. That's because I forced him out of a comfort zone. You know, the old story was with Ted DiBiase and Paul Orndorff. Orndorff was a great talent, and he would get so mad at me every time we'd hand out the checks because he always thought he was more valuable than I thought he was. And so, but one thing about Orndorff, as mad as he get, he'd never lay down the ring. He had too much pride where he was always going to give it his all. So we had a match with Ted and Orndorff. We were getting ready to turn one of them, and they were both still baby faces in Jackson, Mississippi. And I wanted them to go an hour Broadway. And I hate hour Broadways, but it just was something that would just click with these two guys. And they didn't think they could do it. And they kept coming to me and trying to get me to change it and change it and change it. And finally I said, well, look, guys, I said, I realize you guys are sissies and you can't do it. You guys are just so weak. You're a couple of wusses. Here, I'll give you a finish, but you can't do the finish till 5 minutes of the hour. If you get to the 5 minutes of the hour and you can't make it through, here's what you can do. But you can't go before then. And I left them with it. Well, they went out there in that ring, and I want to tell you, they gave it their all, and they buzzed that hour, and they had the people standing. They had the people standing, and they both grew that night. Those two guys grew up that night. It changed them forever as to who they were and their confidence. Well, that was what you called building a star. You have to get them to where they believe in themselves. Then once you got them to where they believe in themselves, you had to keep their melon head under control because their melon head would outgrow them. But if you didn't have that cockiness, if you didn't have that thing where they started believing in themselves, because their belief is what projected to the people. So, yeah, so stars like that and that Michael Hayes, my gosh, yes, I saw this Gordy was 19 years old. He could do everything. I didn't care if we got Michael Hayes or not. To tell you the truth at the time, I wanted Gordy. But Michael Hayes was like he was Gordy's alter ego. You couldn't get Gordy without Michael. Well, Michael, and he'll get so angry at me, but he and I thought Michael always was backwards with his psychology as a worker in the ring. The greatest manager going. But I don't want my manager getting shellacked in the ring until the time is right. So Buck Robley was booking for me at the time, and Buck all of a sudden had a trade worked out with Florida to trade him down for Stan Lane and Steve Kern, I believe. And I said, you're not trading these guys. These guys are awesome. What we're going to do is get Michael Hayes out of the ring. And I'd brought Buddy Roberts way back originally with me from Minneapolis when I first bought the promotion. What we needed was a guy that could take the bumps. You got the big guy out there, Gordy, and then Michael Hayes out there to do the talking and do the things that only Michael Hayes can do. And when we made that combination, it became mind-boggling box office. So we hit some shots that were good, and we also had some times that we did things that didn't work out. That was just part of the deal that you had to experiment with. I remember Ernie Ladd telling me about he could make a star out of Ray Candy. I said, you can't make a star out of Ray Candy. I've tried. You can't do it. Ernie Ladd sold out everywhere with Ray Candy. Mm-hmm. But we let people exercise if they cared enough to put themselves on the line for it, then we'd give them a chance to try things.
Tony, what's going on?
Hey, guys, how you doing? It's great to talk to a great promoter and three great authors.
Oh.
Scott, I love the Terry Funk book. It was terrific.
Oh, thanks very much.
I just pre-ordered the Amazon, your book on Amazon with the Cowboys book.
Cool.
Great. Okay, my question is to Bill, and I hate to ask a question when you're only at the job 3 months, but someone once said when you work for the WWF, WWE, you hand your life to Vince McMahon, meaning you have no social life, everything is wrestling. Would you concur with that statement?
He's a workaholic. He's definitely a workaholic, and you know, when you run a wrestling business, you live it. I did too. I mean, I understood where he was because that's how I was. You live the business. I mean, and if you're the guy running it and owning it, you expect everything to revolve around you. he was just running a huge operation with every single detail revolving around him. Yeah, and you hit it just right. I just realized that I wasn't ready to make that kind of commitment to him. I gave him my all while I was there because that's the way I always am, but I knew I wasn't going to stay up there and unless I had something that I was building that was going to be that had a value to it.
And when you say Vince isn't, because a lot of people just talk about his creative mind, but he's also involved a lot in the business side, right? I mean, you can't
Oh yeah, and his wife too. I mean, Vince is involved in every single aspect, and he generally has good people up there. You know, he had some really good people, but he was involved in every single aspect of the business, not just
creative,
the talent.
And are you surprised hopefully he's still going to be in it, but Jim Ross's longevity in the business as a power player, and he's just a terrific career when a lot of guys are out of the business.
Well, no, Jim Ross is a student of the business. Jim is probably one of the most valuable guys I ever had. I mean, Jim Ross he earned his way all the way up. He was my right-hand man. I trusted him. He was a great confidant. He was a great student of the business. I hired Jim right out of college, and he learned it all. He learned how to referee. He used to sell radio time, so he understood the sales. He understood the syndication. He did everything. As a matter of fact, if you really want to stop and think, if we got a second here, when I went to WCW, the key thing they asked me is, can you walk in and fire Dusty Rhodes? Because they wanted to blame everything that was wrong there on Dusty. Dusty was booking there. And I said, sure, I can fire Dusty. That's no big deal. I can book and do it all, which is, I think, one of the things that hurt Crockett. I think Crockett didn't feel that he could do anything without Dusty because Crockett can't book, in my opinion. So, but I said the first thing about Dusty is I've worked with him, and as long as he knows who's boss, I got no problem working with him. So before I fire him, let me walk in here and tell him I'm taking over and see if he wants to work with me, because he's a brilliant, brilliant guy. We need all the brains we can get. And I walked in and told Dusty the deal, and he said, baby, let's just get it going. And we shook hands and we hugged, and that was it. Dusty just busted his butt and went to work. Now to go back the other way, when Bischoff took over, the first guy fired was Jim Ross, the smartest guy there.
You think
the guy that knew it all.
You think that he maybe had Bischoff, and he took it out on Jim?
Well, Jim Ross, Bischoff didn't like Jim Ross, but, Bischoff was kind of in a left-handed deal when we got there. The only reason he got to stay was because he'd already moved and acted on his contract, because really there wasn't anything much he could do. We didn't think he was that good a booth announcer or anything else, so we didn't really have a place for him. But we were trying to work him into something when I decided that I just wasn't going to stay any longer, and I decided to go home. But if the difference is, why would you go fire the sharpest guy there just to stroke your own ego?
Right.
That's insane. And the proof of the pudding was that Jim Ross's track record after that. Jim Ross was a success everywhere he went. I got nothing but the highest regard for Jim Ross.
My last question, Bill, and I believe were one of the first people that really respected Dave as a reporter.
Oh boy.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah.
I'm sure there were some ups and downs, but can you talk about that when you first discovered Dave and his newsletter?
I thought he made a lot of sense, and I thought that we had a certain rapport there. And Dave is catering to his reading clientele. I like to keep those type of things arm's length, but I think we had a certain rapport for a period of time there. I don't think he understood everything I was doing or the reason, and he has his own opinion of them, which he certainly has the right to do. I think a lot of people didn't understand that. For instance, when I changed the rules about coming off the top rope, I didn't want to get rid of any of the excitement. I wanted to create again the suspense of being if something is illegal. See, I've always believed this. That if a villain can walk in and beat a babyface without cheating, then he ought to be the babyface. And so, if the villain has to cheat to win, that's where the animosity, that's where the concept was that made the people upset, because they were relating to the babyface, and the villain was their boss or whoever they were mad at or whatever that they were taking their emotion out on. So all I was doing was getting some mystery back in to the wrestling to where you couldn't do it blatantly in front of the referee. We never had the the deal. And the other thing was removing the padding around the ring, because again, remember that $30,000 survey where people said we want something opposite than Vince. Well, if we're going to go opposite of Vince, what were we going to sell? We were going to sell that Vince was a cartoon and that we were the legitimate tough guy stuff. So to move the mats around most of the time mats around the ring on the outside, all you do is hook your ankle in them, or somebody's spilled Coke on them. We'd been taking bumps on the floor with the concrete, most of us in the business, all our lives. So it wasn't a big deal. It gave an illusion of we're more dangerous. So, some of those things that I don't think they understood. They also didn't understand the fact that we had to get some control back over the contracts. Guess what? Our guys were stale, too. Again, even if you have chocolate cake, you don't want it every week. I think Turner Broadcasting, in my opinion, their legal people must have just let every single agent that the wrestlers hired walk in and create their own contract. They were all different. They were all ludicrous. There was absolutely no control over the wrestler. A wrestler could get hurt and he could just take off and get paid without having to be backed or anything else. So
that's one of the main reasons they went out of business. There was guaranteed contracts. It was
crazy.
Well, they wanted a business. I mean, the reason they wanted a business at the end was because it was a horrible product.
A million of them.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, they made money. In Bill's, the last year that they were in that company, they still, because of the changes in the industry and television, they still brought in $125 million the last year that they were in business, and they spent close to, I don't know, what was it, $200 million? And there you go.
That's called having a galloping case of the dumbass.
Yeah.
How can you gross that much and still go out of business?
Actually, Bill, there are a lot of you've got a lot of tapes. Actually, I think your wife has a library. Would you like to see WWE take that stuff and do something with it? Maybe put it on 24/7, or are you happy that Vince has not gotten hold of it?
Well, I really don't care. I mean, I lost all that in a lot of the legalese that went through with my family and the divorce, and I mean, it was just so, when I let go of all that, I let go of all of it. I mean, whatever they can do with it, that's wonderful. I don't care one way or another. I'm very happy with what I did in the business, and thought that I had a great career, and I love talking about it, and I love some of the great memories. But I think at this point that, again, if you get back into why did I write the book even, I finally realized that, we go through this life, and there's a problem that maybe we need to think about, that as human beings we have a terminal disease called mortality. And the current death rate's 100%. Yeah. And we don't like to think about death, especially our own, yet worldwide 3 people die every second, 180 every minute, and nearly 11,000 every hour. That brings up a question for each of us: where will we spend eternity? So there was a guy named Pascal that did a wager. He was a 17th century mathematician, Blaise Pascal, and he came up with a concept. Basically, was this: I would rather live my life as if there is a God, and die to find out there isn't, than live my life as if there isn't and die to find out there is. So all I'm saying is, in life, that we make choices and we have consequences for our choices. So I tried to keep it real. I tried to show in this book all the choices I made and the consequences of those choices. And I tried to do it in a way that was very revealing, where I laid myself out there in life, in my wrestling, in my family life, and in every aspect of life. Because my whole concept about this, when Scott started talking to me about doing this book, was if it could change one person's life, if one person could get something. I mean, yeah, you guys know I can talk. We've been talking for over an hour. But I wanted to talk in a way that hopefully had a value, a lasting value, where if you could change one kid's life. Because one thing about it, I love wrestling, and I think wrestling has a huge influence on kids and people that watch it, and I don't see any moral or ethical value being promoted in wrestling anymore. I see it as being beyond the pale, where it's lost all responsibility morally and ethically to our society and our culture. And I just wanted to leave something behind where people could say that happened to want to pick up that book, they could see it down and dirty in the mud, the blood, and the beer, and then they could see me at age 66 looking back at my life and seeing my life a completely different way now, and trying to give them something that they might consider to think about what are they going to do and where are they going to spend eternity.
So are you aware of what WWE is doing with Eddie Guerrero? And if so, your thoughts on that?
No, I'm not aware.
All right.
Okay. Well,
It's probably better that way.
Okay.
It's pretty tacky.
Well, what, as far as, we were talking earlier about Jim Ross, what were your thoughts when they decided to dump Jim Ross as an announcer? Because I would say that shocked a lot of people.
Well, I don't know that much about it, and I talked to Jim because, Jim was going through some tremendous health challenges at the time, and I know Jim's feelings were really, really hurt. His feelings were he thought that he'd earned a certain loyalty because he'd been loyal to Vince, and on the outside looking in, I don't know the insides of everything that go on, so, it's kind of hard sometimes for me to give you an opinion that would have a true value, but I know Jim was hurt terribly about it, and when he called me and talked to me about it, I said, Jim, what you're going through internally and in your health and everything else, that's tremendous shock and trauma to your system. Why don't you get well first? Let go of this. The wrestling business can change every day, and let's just concentrate on yourself and your health and get well. So I didn't get into it with Jim about all the ins and outs, but I know he really felt that he was taken advantage of and was made to look bad, and it really hurt him because he had a great respect. Jim Ross is a great guy for whoever he works for. He gives you his all, and he gave Vince McMahon his all. So, it was a sad thing to hear how hurt he was, but I don't know enough about it to make a good judgment on it either way.
Okay, let's go to James in Tallahassee, Florida. James, what's going on?
Hey, it's an honor to be on with you, sir.
Well, thank you.
And hey, Brian, Dave, and Scott, it's great to be on with you guys also.
Cool.
Thank you. And Bill, isn't the gospel great?
Yes, amen.
Amen to that. I wanted to say, I went to my first real Southern wrestling show in the South when I went to the house show in Tallahassee, WWE house show, and the one thing I noticed, Dave, I never picked this up, Dave, Brian, you guys could comment, just how many African Americans there are, who attend a pro wrestling event in the South, and just like the proportion of the audience was 40% African American.
Right.
And just, you were the first really to pick up on that, and just your thoughts on, how the outreach to African Americans and how the product, is catered to them.
I think been one of the only. They still severely underpromote to that demographic.
Yeah. I think you guys hit it right on the head. Here I'm looking in the business, and every sport is dominated by the black athlete, except wrestling, which is a manipulated sport, and they're strictly in a role like a token. And it was horrible. And so I looked at my demographics. One thing I learned early on was to start studying the demographics, my television demographics. So I look at that and I see the ratings and I see what our audience is made up. And I'm in Louisiana and Mississippi, and I don't have a black star. So I said I've got to find a black star. And so then when you start looking to try to create this, you've got to look again for somebody that when you get them there, that they have what you're looking for. They have all the integrity and everything to go with it. So that was a process that I tried several, and maybe the time wasn't right for them. But I'll tell you what changed my life was when Ernie Ladd and I got to know each other, because Ernie was a rookie the same year I was rookie in pro football, and I didn't like him. I thought he was smart aleck. Ernie Ladd was one of the greatest human beings that ever walked, and I just didn't know him. I didn't know him. And so when I got to know Ernie Ladd and we got to start doing business together, what a deal it was. I count Ernie Ladd one of the greatest human beings I've ever met. And Ernie gave me a great perspective. As much as a white man, a white man's going to be very limited in what he's going to know. I don't care what about being black because he's not black. But he gave me that empathy and that feeling, and he taught me so much. And then I found this kid, the Junkyard Dog, who I think Jake the Snakes Roberts came with him. He was up in Calgary, and I saw that thing in him, and we brought him in and gave him the name and the music and the whole bit, and we started trying to create a star, and it worked. It was just awesome. So yeah, to me, the black athlete had a place in our business and that he deserved and needed and should be, and nobody was doing it. So yes, I feel that one thing I can look back on my life and my career, that was one great contribution that I got to make, was to be a part of that, and what a wonderful thing it was, because, again, my friendship with Ernie Ladd and the different people that I got involved with. So that was a great time.
Now, in 1980, when JYD was really starting to hit his stride and you were starting to do some real big business, actually, for that time period, it was kind of mind-boggling business.
Yeah, it was.
What were the other promoters, all over the country? What was their reaction? Because like there were, as I remember being a fan then, there were certain stars, and JYD and Michael Hayes were certainly unknowns to most people. I mean, the big money stars were the people, they would go from territory to territory. You were one of them, Dusty Rhodes. Those were the guys who were supposed to be Harley Race, that were supposed to be drawing the big money, Andre. And you drew with these guys that were unknowns, JYD, being basically a creation of, your company. What was the reaction elsewhere?
Well, I just really don't know. We were starting to draw money with more than JY. We'd gotten our package together. We had phenomenal talent. I mean, Dickie Murdoch. Dick Murdoch was one of the all-time greats in the business. I mean, he was unbelievable. Killer Carl Cox. When I had Gary Hart in the spoiler, I had finally got to the point, and I love the tough guys. You remember, I had Duggan, I had Doc, I had so many tough guys, and so the bottom line is we just had great talent. Let me tell you the thing that was a turning point for me, too. One time my territory was down. And one thing I'd learned by then is sometimes you're so deep in the trees you can't see the forest. And so I called Jerry Jarrett, and I said, Jerry, I want you to fly over, and all I want you to do is watch my television and then tell me what you see, because I'm not seeing something, and my towns are down. And so Jerry Jarrett flies over with Jerry the King Lawler. They watch my TV show, and they come in after they do the TV show, and they made a remark. It was kind of an off-color remark, like, where's all these girls that do a certain type of thing that is known in the industry, and where are the? And I said, wait a minute, guys, I brought you over here to help me, to look at this, and you're wanting to know about girls. You guys got more girls in Tennessee than we ever dreamed of, or whatever. I said, what are you doing? You're not helping me. And they said, Bill, listen to us. Where are all the young girls? Because where the young girls go, the young guys are. He said, you got the toughest wrestlers in the world, but look at your audience. Your audience is out there, and you don't have any young kids. You don't have anybody young. You got all these tough guys, but there's no youth out there. There's nobody out there. Wherever the young girls are, the young guys are, that's where the money is. And I looked at it, and he was right. And that's when I realized. And so, as you saw, right after that, we went with the Rock and Roll Express. We went with the Midnight Express. It didn't change the fact that we had the tough guys. And as a matter of fact, we had to create a situation as to how could these little bitty guys be booked in a match with these tough guys and live. And that made it so exciting because, we said, well, they're tag team specialists, or they're this, or they're that, or the other. And what we did, we created a situation where we had the biggest and the toughest, and we also had the good-looking. And Magnum TA was a product of that. We made him into a sex symbol. We bought him his leather clothes and everything like that, and started teaching him because he didn't have any charisma at the time, and he learned. And then Dusty got him, and his career was off like a rocket until he had that car wreck. So what we realized is we had to cater to that demographic. And that's how we kind of got there. So we were really studying. Ernie Ladd was the guy that really got me going on studying our demographics. And Jim Ross and Ernie Ladd, two completely different people that got me to the same place. I was so blessed in that business, it was mind-boggling.
Darren in Alabama. Darren, you're on with Cowboy Bill.
Oh, how y'all doing?
Doing good.
Howdy. Wanted to talk to you, kind of touching on it before the last break, but kind of wanted to hear about the mind state when you made Ron Simmons the champion, because he wasn't exactly a main event at the time, and Vader was like a monster, kind of just squashing everybody. So what was kind of the thought process behind making Simmons the champ?
Well, I've always looked to see if they got some athletic ability, and without a doubt, he had an athletic track record that was just phenomenal. I think Ron gave it his all. I just think that he had a hard time getting it to the next level there, because if I had it to do all over, I'd do it again. He was a class guy. Bobby Bowden was willing to do interviews for him. Bobby Bowden's always supported guys that have played ball for him. So he had everything that I was looking for. And the biggest thing was, too, nobody saw it coming. That was another thing. I love to have that mystery. One thing about Dave is one of the sharpest guys out there. And I think I fooled Dave a lot of the time. Well, that was great to me, because if I could take a guy that's with it, that's making his living off of this stuff, and occasionally have him wondering what I'm going to do too, that's great, because what we had to get back to is the guys had given the business away. And we need to get back to the fact that if we were going to have our fans, that, if you know the ending to every movie before you go see it, why go see it? It's kind of like my wife wanted me to go see Titanic. I said, what do I want to go see Titanic for? I know what happened. The boat sank. Well, then, you know, if I know who's going to win at every match, I could care less about going and watching it. I want to have some mystery. I want to have some excitement. I want to think who I know, and the next thing is I don't want to know how they're going to win. So we like to have the mystery, and so with Ron Simmons, it worked out phenomenal. It was a great time and a great thing, and I think he did good. Some guys just can't get it over the edge, and maybe at that time in his life, I don't know how well he's doing now or what he's doing, but at that time in the life, maybe he just couldn't quite get it on over the edge. But he certainly tried, and then we were also having problems dealing with different people that we had in the mix.
Bill, we've got to go. We're totally out of time.
All right, thank you, guys.
Okay, thank you, Bill. We'll see everybody next week.